Okay, so in the introductory video, I went through several different things that can moderate aggressive responses, including individual differences, situations, social rules, and so on. So we're going to go through individual differences and situations in this particular video, and in the next one, we're going to go through attributions and social rules. So when we think about individual differences in aggressive behavior, there's a couple of different things that we can focus on. First of all is the presence of testosterone. Aggressivity is typically associated with higher levels of testosterone. Now keep in mind testosterone is present in both people who are biologically male and people who are biologically female, but people who are biologically male tend to have more testosterone in their system. Research has shown you can measure testosterone with a little swipe of the cheek, and research has shown that when people engage in aggressive actions, there tends to be a spike in their testosterone. And once again, there are some gender differences where males tend to be more likely to be physically aggressive compared to females. Males commit the overwhelming percentage of violent crime, including murder. And these patterns are fairly universal across different countries, indicating that equity is not necessarily the driving force. Women tend to be a great deal more relationally aggressive. Once again, we've already talked about that in the first set of videos. Genetics can also lead to some individual differences in aggression. So for example, identical twin studies have shown that identical twins tend to be more correlated in their aggressive tendencies than fraternal twins, indicating there is some genetic component to aggressive tendencies. So now that we've talked about individual differences, let's go ahead and talk about certain components of the situation that can lead people to become more or less aggressive. So there are many components about a situation that can induce aggressive behavior, but we're going to talk about the first one right now, which is frustration. The frustration aggression hypothesis was proposed by Dollard in 1939, and it's a very simple sort of theory that basically when people are frustrated, that will lead to a drive to aggress. We can think of frustration as the blocking of a goal-directed behavior. Now, I'm very struck by the fact that there's a whole lot of frustrated people out there right now who have had their goal-directed behavior blocked. They might have had plans that have had to be suddenly changed. They might be frustrated because they have to work from home and it's a lot more complicated with kids around. They might be frustrated because they don't have the thing that they want at the store anymore, or because they're frightened, or because they are bored. And those are all potential sources of frustration that can in turn lead to a drive to aggress. So for example, you can experience physical pain, discomfort, or irritation, which can frustrate your goal to feel good. So someone who is really annoyed at a situation, irritated, or uncomfortable can be frustrated. Research has shown that people who are in really, really strong heat waves, for example, often are more aggressive. And one of the underlying things behind that, once again, is irritation and discomfort. That is a source of frustration. People can also experience mental frustration, where they're denied expectations or rewards, and that becomes their source of frustration. Furthermore, the closer you are to achieving the goal, the more frustrated it is when that goal is blocked. So for example, if you're expecting something and it doesn't go your way, that's thought to be a blocked goal, which then leads to a drive to aggress. So here's some of the evidence for frustration aggression hypothesis. I already gave you a little preview in the previous slide. For example, there's been consistent archival evidence to suggest that whenever there's a heat wave, that tends to be strongly correlated with when people are most likely to engage in rioting behaviors, to the highest likelihood of batters getting hit by pitches, and to spikes in murder rates. Now, it's interesting to note that when we're dealing with archival data, it's important to control for alternative causes. So for example, when taking a look at batters hit by pitches, the researchers who studied that were trying to account for things like whether the pitcher was fresh or not, as well as how often they tended to hit batters generally and when they tended to hit them more. So you can see how they would try to control for those various factors to make sure that it was a matter of temperature and not other potential issues at work. And once again, there has been some laboratory evidence to suggest that when you raise the temperature in the room, people are more likely to engage in aggressive tasks through things like the sound blast game. There is a lot of research to suggest that when people are otherwise uncomfortable, they are also more likely to become aggressive. So for example, when you crowd in people per square mile, or when they experience a great deal of noise and noise pollution in their daily living, that tends to be correlated with increases in aggressive behavior within those communities. So you can break it down by neighborhood in terms of who tends to be more packed in and how loud that particular area is and how that might correlate with aggressive behavior. Once again, controlling for things like the socioeconomic status of the individuals within that community. You can also explore things like how close someone is to the front of the line when, for example, tickets sell out. So they've actually taken a look at how close someone is to their goal before it is frustrated to see how frustrated they are. So the person who's second in line when the tickets sell out is much more frustrated than the person who's 12th in line. So the closer you are to your goal, the more frustrated you are when that goal is blocked. This applies not only to interpersonal violence, but also group level violence. So for example, evidence collected for the frustration aggression hypothesis has explored the circumstances under which groups of people are likely to enact acts of violence against other groups of people. So for example, acts of lynching or genocide. And the research tends to show that these acts of mass violence tend to be provoked by economic hardship, which can be another source of frustration. So for example, there was a study that took a look at mapping frequencies of lynching in the South along with the price of cotton. And what they found was that as the price of cotton dropped, that rates of lynching tended to go up. So those two things were correlated with one another, suggesting once again, with all the caveats of archival data, that those two things tended to be linked, that people might be feeling the pinch economically, which might make them more likely to lash out at another group in an act of violence. The rejection and teasing research tends to be a little bit mixed. Sometimes people, when they are rejected, behave in ways that are aggressive. Sometimes they behave in ways that attempt to realign themselves with the group. It tends to be a bit of a mixed bag, and it's hard to break down when someone will become aggressive and when someone will be pro-social. But usually it relates to whether you think that your pro-social behavior will actually work. And it depends on your perceived goals. If, for example, you know you're going to see that person later, you might be much more likely to engage in pro-social behavior, versus if you're never going to see them again, you might be more likely to engage in aggression as kind of like a final send-off. I'll show you. So if your goals are to fit in, then you'd be pro-social. If they're to get revenge, you'd be aggressive. It also depends on your perceived options. We talked a little bit about this in class before we left for spring break. Sometimes people are only given the choice to be aggressive or to not be aggressive. They're not given the choice to be aggressive or to help. And so sometimes results have to be looked at a little bit sideways because people's options that they're given are fairly limited. And if they were given other options, they might have behaved differently. So we've talked about how the situation can sometimes be frustrating. Let's talk about circumstances where the situation can be perceived as threatening. So when we perceive threatening situations, that also increases the likelihood of an aggressive response. There are many ways to study this, but one of the ways that we've done it in the field of psychology is to explore how people can be primed with cues that can lead them to perceive the situation as more threatening, to see if those particular environments will be more likely to provoke aggression than a neutral situation. So, for example, Berkowitz and Lepage in 1967 performed a study exploring what they called the weapons effect. What they did in this particular study was they set people up in a laboratory in order to explore their responses to a series of questionnaires and an activity that they could do to measure aggressive behavior. And in the room was either a badminton racket or an air rifle. And they were told as they entered the room that the particular prop that was placed in there was for another experiment and to just ignore it. But what they found is that people who were in the room with the air rifle were more likely to respond with more aggression in the tasks that they did, and were more likely to perceive the situation as threatening. One of the things that we'll see when it comes to priming for aggressive behavior is that you can prime for aggressive behavior when it comes to taking a look at highly publicized reports, both of self-violence and other violence. So highly publicized suicides tend to result in a spike in suicide. It tends to be specific to the region in question and the method utilized. There's also other characteristics where the people who commit suicide are more likely to look like the person in question. So if it's a famous celebrity who is a certain gender, then the spike in suicide tends to correspond to that. This is also interesting and kind of food for thought. When there's a highly publicized spike in a highly publicized public figure that's committed suicide, in addition to spikes in suicide, there's also spikes in single car, single victim fatalities, meaning that it's not classified necessarily as a suicide, but it would be where the car would drive off the road, wouldn't necessarily crash into any other cars, and there'd be a single driver. When there's highly publicized murder-suicides, then there's an increase in single car, multiple victim fatalities, where there's a driver and a passenger that drive off the road and both people within the car die. Now, once again, it's important to understand that when you take a look at these patterns of data, that what they aren't suggesting is that when people read these stories, they're all of a sudden brainwashed into doing something that they would never do. What this does is take someone who's already on the edge and it just pushes them a little bit further. So you can think that someone who might already be considering this might read this story, and this might, once again, just kind of push them a little bit further in that direction. There's all sorts of ways to reduce the suicide contagion effect through responsible reporting. So for example, not sensationalizing, not publicizing the method used, and making sure to use specific terminology in order to reduce the contagion effect. So there is responsible reporting methods in order to make sure that this is less likely to happen. So the boxing match. There's a study that you can read about in your readings about the social animal about highly publicized boxing matches and homicide rates that follow. So for example, they were exploring interracial heavyweight boxing championships to see if that would mirror subsequent homicides. And what they found is that heavily publicized boxing matches tended to result in spikes in homicide rates 3 days after the event, and that the victim of the homicide was slightly more likely to be the same race as the person who would lose the boxing championship, indicating that there's a slight prime going on, a slight modeling of behavior that can occur, and that can take people who are already on edge and kind of push them to engage in behavior a little bit more. And once again, you can read that particular article from your readings textbook. They also do a very good job trying to indicate how they controlled for other factors. For example, they took a look at whether it was due to gambling. So they took a look at other other areas of sports where there was heavy gambling and they didn't find the same sort of patterns. And they made sure to account for weekends. People are more violent on the weekends, and holidays. People are more violent on the holidays. And in order to control for those different variables. So it's a very interesting exploration of archival research if you want to take a look at that for your reaction paper. And once again, this would be priming a pattern and slightly increasing people's aggressive tendencies. This isn't necessarily taking someone who would never behave aggressively and pushing them to the point of murder. This is taking someone who's already feeling that edge and just pushing them over it. And once again, they controlled for things like the time of year, the temperature, and holidays in order to make sure that that wasn't a factor. Whenever you explore archival research, those would be the various things that you do in order to ensure that it might be more the thing that you think is related and less these other obvious potential alternative causes. In addition to priming, you can think of mere association as being a form of priming. So for example, people were shown a clip from a boxing match in a study and then were asked to engage in a game where they could behave aggressively towards a potential student. And that student they were behaving aggressively toward was either listed as a college boxer or a speech major. And the people who interacted with the college boxer were more aggressive toward that boxer than the speech major. The film itself was starring Kirk Douglas, a famous classic film actor, and at the time this study was done, Kirk Douglas was well enough known, so people would have known his acting name. And they also did a version of the study where they could either behave aggressively towards someone named Kirk Anderson or someone named Bob Anderson. People were slightly more aggressive towards Kirk, indicating once again that association. I just saw this boxing clip where someone whose acting name was Kirk was really aggressive. I'm going to translate that and associate it with this upcoming person who has some similarities to that clip.